Welcome to the CNS Pacademia session. My name is Mawhid and Haque.
I'm Mohammed Qeshta. Today we'll explain our chapter, which is the central nervous system. Hopefully, you guys.
This chapter is one of the most important for your syllabus, and as well as one of the most interesting chapters, in my opinion. Now we're gonna go overlook what we're gonna learn in this chapter. I have added whatever is deleted, and we're gonna go through all of these sections one by one. Let's get to the first bit. Now, coming directly to a bit of a scary image here. In this picture, you need to learn only what the neural tube differentiates and what it differentiates into. So initially we have a neural tube during embryological development. We have the neural tube which differentiates into different parts of the brain. The different parts of the brain are going to be prosencephalon, mesencephalon and rhombencephalon. What you need to know over here is that prosencephalon forms the forebrain, mesencephalon forms the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon forms the hindbrain. And along with their location. So the prosencephalon is in the lateral ventricles. We'll come to the ventricles right after this, so you understand what it is really. And the mesencephalon is in the cerebral aqueduct, and rhombencephalon is found in the fourth ventricle. Alright, now coming to the brain regions and organization. We divide the adult brain into four regions: the cerebral hemispheres, the brain stem, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. The cerebral hemispheres are the ones that you see the most. And the brain stem, as we all know, is the one that connecting stalk of the brain. The diencephalon lies deep to the cerebral hemispheres, and the cerebellum connects to the brain stem from the posterior. And this is the picture of how, this is going to be a reference picture which I'm going to come back to multiple times. Over here, I want to know, just before we get into everything, we need to know these terms. What is the grey matter and what is white matter? The non-myelinated is the grey matter. The grey matter consists of the neuron cell bodies, but no fiber tracts. The white matter is myelinated and has the neuronal and nerve tracts. Okay. Now we get to the ventricles of the brain. What are the ventricles and its functions? The ventricles are hollow fluid-filled cavities inside the brain. Now, what is their role? The main role is to produce, store, and circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. And the function of the cerebrospinal fluid is to provide cushioning and the nourishment for the brain and spinal cord to stay healthy. This is a very important question. What kind of cells are found in the ventricles? The ependymal cells are found in the ventricles. They produce the CSF and have cilia on them, which helps in circulating the CSF throughout the ventricles. Now, this image is where we learn all about the ventricles. As you can see, this is the lateral ventricle. They go into the two cerebral hemispheres. In the midst of that, we have a septum pellucidum, which is a gap which separates both the lateral ventricles. Connecting the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle is an interventricular foramen. Now, we're going to go back to the image in which ventricle had what part of the brain. So the lateral ventricles were in part of the prosencephalon. Alright? The interventricular foramen connects to the third ventricle. The third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, where we find the mesencephalon. Alright? And now the fourth ventricle has lateral apertures. As you can see better over here, we have lateral apertures and a median aperture which opens directly into the subarachnoid space, where the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, actually circulates. Okay? The layers of the meninges to know over here are important. The three layers of the meninges is the dura mater, arachnoid, and the pia mater. Alright? So from the subarachnoid space, under the arachnoid, the pia mater, there's a space in between where you would have the CSF, and the CSF enters the ventricles through the apertures. Next to the fourth ventricle, we will have the rhombencephalon. That's the information you need to know from the first slide that we discussed before. Now, coming to the cerebral hemispheres, there are a few terms that you need to understand over here. I'm going to first take the term fissure. These are deep grooves in the brain that segregate the parts of the brain, like larger parts of the brain. I'm going to go back up over here so you can understand. This line over here is the median longitudinal fissure, which separates the brain into right and left cerebral hemispheres. And the second fissure is the transverse fissure, which separates the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum. Alright, those are the two fissures. Now over here, I'm going to take an example of a valley and a mountain. We're going to have a valley in between. That's an indentation. That's going to be the sulci. And these two are the gyri. Okay? So the elevated ridges of tissue, which are the mountains in this case, are the gyri. And in the center we have the sulci, which is the valley. Alright? So elevated ridges of tissue called gyri are separated by shallow grooves called sulci, and they mark nearly the entire surface of the brain. The sulci divide each hemisphere into the 5 lobes of the brain: the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and deep within a sulcus, the lateral sulcus, is the 5th lobe, which is the insula. Now, we're going to talk about the sulcus. What kind of sulcuses do we have? We have the central sulcus, which runs in the midline of the brain. In front of the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus and the post-central gyrus in the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, respectively. Alright? And then we have a lateral sulcus, which divides the, we have lateral sulcus here, which divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal. Okay? And we also have a parieto-occipital sulcus, which the name in itself says it separates the parietal with the occipital lobe. Deep within the lateral sulcus is the 5th lobe, which is the insula, which is found when you open the lateral sulcus. So these are the main lobes of the brain, and they're present in both the hemispheres. Now, each cerebral hemisphere has 3 basic regions. The cerebral cortex of grey matter, which looks grey in the fresh brain tissue, the internal white matter, and the basal nuclei, islands of grey matter, situated deep within the white matter. Now, I just want to go back up as a reference picture, as I said. Now, over here, this is the cerebral cortex, this is the white matter, and the nuclei, the grey matter in between, these are the basal nuclei. Okay? So this is what we're going to need to understand, is that grey matter carries only the neuron cell bodies. The white matter has all the neural tracts. It has all the axons. The grey matter does not have any axons in it. Now, we come to the cerebral cortex, or the outer grey matter layer. It is the executive suit of the nervous system where a conscious mind is found. It enables us to be aware of ourselves and our sensations, to communicate, remember, understand, and initiate voluntary movements. The cerebral cortex is composed of grey matter, which has neuron cell bodies, dendrites, associated glia, and blood vessels, but no fiber tracts. What we say with glia is the other cells that are in the CNS. In the CNS, we have the oligodendrocytes, which provide the myelination. We have the ependymal cells, which make the CSF. We have the astrocytes, which provide the nourishment and protection for the brain. And then we have the microglia, which are basically the macrophages of the CNS. In the peripheral nervous system, we have 2 kinds of cells, which are the satellite cells, which have a similar role to the astrocytes in the PNS. And we have the Schwann cell, which provides a myelination in the peripheral nervous system. Now, coming to the cerebral cortex, it has 3 kinds of functional areas: the motor area, sensory area, and association areas. So this is a basic tip, is that when we say motor, associate it with the frontal lobe. When we say sensory areas, associate it with the parietal lobe. Alright? Now, coming to more of a generalization in this, is each hemisphere is chiefly concerned with the sensory and motor functions of the contralateral side of the body. As we have the right and left hemispheres, the nerve fibers will move down, interlace at the level of the brain stem, and this causes the lateralization. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, the left side controls the right side of the body. Although they are largely symmetrical in structure, the 2 hemispheres are not entirely equal in function. Instead, there is lateralization of cortical functions. Alright, for an example to just give you, which we'll come to later on in the slides as well. If you're right-handed, you are most likely left hemisphere dominant. That's going to be responsible for your cognition and language, critical thinking and everything, and your right side of the brain would become more of a creative side. Now, coming to the motor area, as I said, the motor area we associate with the frontal lobe. Now, found in the frontal lobe of each hemisphere, specifically the precentral gyrus for the primary motor cortex. Now, as we spoke, the central sulcus, in front of that we have a gyri, which is the precentral gyrus, which has the primary motor cortex and controls the voluntary movements. In this gyrus, we have neurons, which are called pyramidal cells. In these, the gyres allow us to consciously control the precise or skilled voluntary movements of our skeletal muscles. The long axons project into the corticospinal tracts, which go all the way down the length of your spine. Oh, just coming back to this, actually, you need to know what cells are found in the motor area. The pyramidal cells are important. Now, coming to this, most of the neurons in this gyri control muscles in the body areas having the most precise motor control. There is a term called motor homunculus. It's actually inverted motor homunculus in a way that, let's just take a section of the brain and take two parts of the body, the tongue and the hand, the full arm. Let's just take the full arm, okay? The surface area of the part controlling the tongue will be more than the part controlling the hand, as they require more precise control. That's what the inverted motor homunculus means. The motor innervation of the body is contralateral. Again, how we say the right controls the left and the left controls the right. And this is not really important for you to learn. This is just as a reference image, so you can see how large the area for the smaller parts which are controlled for fine movements are, whereas the larger ones. Okay, now we come to the premotor cortex, just anterior to the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. Now the premotor cortex, just ahead of the gyrus, is the premotor cortex, which plans and organizes the movements. It's a staging and planning area for skilled motor activities. Over here we have the memory, like such as typing or drawing. It requires a more skilled movement, so you need to have a planning. This is where the premotor cortex comes into play and helps you turn the sensory input from another brain area. It helps to control the voluntary movements that rely on feedback. For example, finding a light switch in the dark as well. Now, the Broca's area is the frontal lobe. Is in the frontal lobe, usually on the left side. So you will see on the left side, it will be right here in the frontal lobe, and controls the speech production, language expression, and the motor planning needed for speaking. So we have two areas which help in speech, the Broca's and the vernix area. The Broca's area is for the motor production, which helps you to speak, whereas the vernix is for the understanding of what's being said. So if there is damage to the Broca's area, what's going to happen? It's going to cause us to have problems in the speech, but not a problem in the understanding. And when we get to the vernix, if there is damage in the vernix area, what's going to happen? We'll be able to convey our messages properly, but we'll not be able to understand what's being said to us. So the damage in these areas is a very good clinical question that can really help you in the exam to understand what is really happening in these areas. Now, continuing, we also have a frontal eye field, which is located partially in and anterior to the premotor cortex and superior to the Broca's area. The location of this is not exactly the most important. So the main thing you need to know from here is the frontal eye field controls the voluntary movements of the eye. Now, for the recap, we have a central sulcus, a lateral sulcus. We have 5 lobes: the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and deep within the lateral sulcus is the insula. And when we talk about motor, we talk about the frontal lobe. We have a precentral gyrus, which is central sulcus, precentral gyrus, which is going to be taking care of the primary motor cortex. And just ahead of the primary motor cortex, we have the prefrontal cortex, which helps in doing skilled movements. Behind the central sulcus, we have the postcentral sulcus, the postcentral gyrus, and that's in relation to your sensory, as we're going to get into this right now. Now, coming to the sensory areas, mainly found in other lobes and are areas concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. Now, the primary somatosensory cortex is residing in the postcentral gyrus, which is behind the central sulcus. of the parietal lobe just posterior to the primary motor cortex. The neurons in this girdle receive information from all over the body, and they basically help in a term called spatial discrimination, which means that if I touch you on your wrist, you're able to understand I'm touching you on your wrist. When I'm touching you on your arm, you can understand I'm touching you on your arm. That helps you understand where the sensation is coming from. That's what they mean by spatial discrimination. Now, the amount of sensory cortex devoted to a particular body region is related to that region's sensitivity. Again, we come to the inverted somatosensory homunculus here, in which again the fingertips are the most sensitive. Hence, they will be taking the most amount of surface area to be controlled and to receive the reception than other body areas. Now, I just want to give you a pro tip before we get into the further terminologies, is that anything that is termed as association area is related to the memory of that sensation. Now, as you'll see here, the somatosensory association cortex just lies posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex and has many connections with it. The main function of it is to integrate sensory inputs and relate to it via the primary somatosensory cortex to produce an understanding of the object being felt. For an example, when you are in the dark, when you feel for something in your pockets, you're able to tell if it's your wallet, if it's your phone or your car keys, because you have the memory. This is where the somatosensory association cortex comes into play, that you have the memory of that object's feel, the texture, the size, and the sensory is just going to take that you're sensing something. So if there's a damage in the somatosensory association cortex, what's going to happen? You will be touching your wallet, but you'll not know it's your wallet because you don't have no memory of that. Now, coming to the visual area, the visual area cortex is seen on the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. Now, as we can tell, occipital basically lies for the vision. Okay, the primary visual cortex is the largest cortical sensory area. It receives the visual information that originates on the retina of the eye. In this part of the brain, the actual vision that you have is translated into electrical impulses, and it goes into the visual association area to understand what's being shown. Again, the association area is for interpretation of what's being shown. It surrounds the primary visual cortex and covers most of the occipital lobe. Communicating with the primary visual cortex, the visual association area uses past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli, the color, form, movement, enabling us to recognize a flower or a person's face and to appreciate what we are seeing. If there's a problem with the visual area in the occipital lobe, we'll have problems in vision. If we have a problem in the visual association area, we're going to have problems in understanding what we are seeing. We can see it but don't recognize it. Now, to the auditory areas, each primary auditory cortex is located on the superior margin of the temporal lobe next to the lateral sulcus. The temporal lobe is here. You're going to see the auditory area in the superior region of this. And the auditory association area again permits the perception of sound stimulus, what we hear and how we remember it. Again, if there's damage in auditory areas, you're going to have problem in your hearing. If you have it in the association area, you're going to have problem understanding what that sound really is, or if you're not able to remember what that sound really is. Now, coming to the olfactory cortex, olfactory refers to the sense of smell. Okay, the primary olfactory cortex lies in the medial aspect of the temporal. We have a superior portion, we have the auditory. The medial portion, we have the olfactory in the temporal lobe. The lobe and the uncus is not really important for you to learn, but the olfactory receptors in the superior nasal conicae relay different sense to this area, which is found in the nasopharynx. Now, the olfactory cortex is part of the old nose brain. This has a relation with the limbic system. That's why there are some sense which provide a lot of emotional value to, it triggers strong feelings and memories, some sense. That's where it comes from. Now, the vestibular or the equilibrium, the cortex imaging studies show that the part of the cortex responsible for the conscious awareness of balance and is located on the posterior part of the insula. Where is the insula found? It is found when you open the lateral sulcus, you will find the insula and the adjacent parietal cortex. So main part is that the vestibular is found in the insula. The gustatory cortex is a region involved in perceiving taste stimuli and located in the insula again, just deep to the temporal lobe, deep in which sulcus. Which sulcus is, which was spread open, we will see the insula. It's a lateral sulcus. Alright? One way to learn, even with the visceral sensory area, let me just get to this first, is that the cortex of the insula, just posterior to the gustatory cortex, is involved in the conscious perception of visceral sensations, of the organ sensations. These include upset stomach, full bladder, and the feeling that your lungs will burst when you hold your breath for too long. Just to remember, a trick to remember will be that insula is deep within the lateral sulcus. So when you go deeper into the body, that's what it controls. So the gustatory cortex will have with the taste stimuli, and then you have the stomach and empty bladder. All your visceral organs is controlled by the insula. That's where your sense comes from. Okay, now we're coming to the multimodal association areas. The multimodal association areas allow us to give meaning to the information that we receive, store it in memory, tie it to previous experiences and knowledge, and decide what action to take. It's basically the integration of the whole brain coming together. And the multimodal association cortex seems to be where sensations, thoughts, emotions become conscious to make us who we are. Without this, there would be absolutely no coordination between the different parts of the brains that we just talked about. Now, we have three parts in the multimodal association area: the anterior association, the posterior association, and the limbic association areas. Let me give an example which we will run through as we go forward with these association areas. Suppose there is an acid spill, it's in your textbook. If you have an acid spill, your anterior association area will help you analyze, will help you make the decision of what to do. This will help you in the motor movement of stepping away. The posterior association area is going to give you the sense of your space, of where to move. Your limbic association area is going to provide you with the sense of danger that is there when the acid has spilled. Let's move on with this. The anterior association area located in the frontal lobe. Again, when we see the frontal lobe, we always come down to the motor. It's connected somewhat to the motor. I also call the prefrontal cortex. I think it's a very common term which everyone hears all the time about. When you grow up, your prefrontal cortex develops. This is true for it's for your main intellect, complex learning abilities, working memory, language, abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, persistence, and planning all come from this prefrontal cortex, and it reaches a maturity by the age of 25. Now, the posterior association area is a large region encompassing parts of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. Again, sensation is always away from the frontal. The frontal is for motor works mostly, and the prefrontal cortex is ahead, and it helps in all of the understanding, learning, memory, and so on. The sensory is always going to be in the temporal, posterior, occipital lobes. This area plays a role in recognizing patterns and faces, localizing us and our surroundings in space, involved in understanding written and spoken language, and binding different sensory inputs into a coherent whole. In the acid spill example, your awareness of the entire scene originates from this area. The whole awareness that, oh, it had spilled, I have the space around me to move, then the anterior association area will help you to move. And now we come to the limbic association area. It's not very important as per your exam point of view, but it's always good to know what is helping in what. The limbic association area includes a cingulate gyrus. You don't need to know all the gyres and parahippocampal gyrus. The hippocampus, you need to know that hippocampus is a part which plays a huge role in your limbic system, the emotional system of your brain. Okay. In our example above, it provides us a sense of danger, as I mentioned, when the acid splashes on our legs. The hippocampus establishes memories that allow us to remember this incident. Let me give you a clinical case for this example. If there's a problem in your parahippocampal gyrus, you're gonna start having dementia, amnesia. It's a clinical case for this. If there's a problem in the parahippocampus gyrus, and there's also a part called uncus at the end of it, but it's not necessary to learn that. It's good for having extra information. Just a clinical case that you have over here. what happens when you have a tumor in the anterior association area. It can cause problems in the mental and personality disorders, leading to loss of judgment, attentiveness, and everything, because you have the prefrontal cortex here. And if there's damage in that, it's going to affect your ability to make the decisions that you're making. The different problems arise for individuals with lesion in the posterior association part provides awareness of self in space. You'll feel like you're not part of your body, is not part of yourself. For example, in this, they may refuse to wash or dress the side of the body opposite to the lesion because that doesn't belong to me. It feels like it's not a part of me. Somehow, it's actually wonderful how the brain works, even though it's a whole body part they can control. But if there's a damage in that association area, it's gonna just change everything for you. This chapter is actually all about understanding. It's like I'm telling you, like you can learn central sulcus. It's just moving around with your head, visualize everything on your head, on your own head, and understand what's really happening with the brain here. Now, coming to the lateralization of cortical functioning. The term cerebral dominance designates the hemisphere that is dominant for language. Like I mentioned before as well, in most people, the left hemisphere has greater control over language, abilities, math, and logic. The so-called dominant hemispheres is working when we compose a sentence, add numbers, memorize a list, and so on, which helps us to make the decision, everything. It's more of our technical, more practical side of the brain. I am right-handed, so my left brain is more dominant. And then my right side of the brain, which controls my left hand, is going to be more of a creative side for making my innovative ideas. And it's poetic, and it's a side of the nature, insightful. Left dominant people usually are right-handed and vice versa. That's what we mean by lateralization of cortical functioning. But to note again that not each part of the brain is not particularly specialized or does the whole work. The brain always works in synergy. There's, like we spoke about the multimodal association areas, they're bringing it together. Okay? Now, the cerebral white matter consists of largely of myelinated fibers bundled into large tracts. Another terminology over here which you need to know is when CNS, the axons, bundle of axons is called tracts. In PNS, it's called nerves. So when you talk about tracts, they're just a bundle of axons. Okay, they're found in myelination, in myelinated fibers. Now, there are three types of fibers in the white matter. We have the association fibers, which connect different parts of the same hemisphere. Within the right hemisphere, we need to have connections that connect the brain there. That's going to be the association fibers. Then we have the commissural fibers, which run horizontally. This connects the two hemispheres, the right and left hemispheres. The largest commissure is the corpus callosum, which runs just superior to the lateral ventricle. And you can actually see it in the images which we go ahead with. Okay? And this anterior and posterior commissures are not the most important, but the corpus callosum is definitely the most important as your largest commissural fiber as per the exam point of view. Now, the projection fibers either enter the cerebral cortex from the lower brain or cord centers and descend from the cortex to lower areas. This is the vertical. So we had the commissure fibers which are running horizontally between the two hemispheres, and then we have the projection fibers which are running vertically, which are going through the spinal cord and coming back up. Those are the projection fibers. For example, like we spoke about the pyramidal cells which are in the cerebral cortex, which sends down signals in the corticospinal tract. Those are projection fibers, which they go all the way down to the spinal level. Now, the fibers that radiate fan-like through the cerebral white matter of the cortex, this distinctive arrangement is called corona radiata. We have an internal capsule. So this is our cerebral cortex, the white matter. These are the nerve tracks. Do you see the contralateral? We have our spine, like the nerves tracks going across each other. That's why the right controls the left. It happens at the level of the brain stem. When it goes up, it goes in a bundle. It's called the internal capsule. And then they project into the cerebral cortex. And that's called the corona radiata. And as you can see, the association fibers are going to be inside the same hemisphere. The commissural fiber, this is the lateral ventricle, this is the third ventricle. This is the corpus callosum, which is the largest. It connects both the hemispheres. And the projection fibers are going down from the cortex, going all the way down into this. And that's what is crossing. So this is just a very visual. If you remember these images, you will be very, if they give you these images in the exam, you'll be able to visualize everything just by looking at the photo. Now we come to the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are islands of grey matter in the white matter. Just to go for a reference again, do you see the grey? Those are the basal nuclei. That's what we're going to be talking about right now. Now, they are primarily involved with movement. That's what you need to know. Now, this is where a bit of a memorization part comes into. The basal nuclei include the caudate, nucleus putamen, and globus pallidus. The main thing you need to know here is what comes together to form what. The comma-shaped caudate nucleus arches superiorly over the diencephalon. As per the exam point of view, your locations are not the most important, but what forms it? So we have the caudate plus the putamen forming the striatum. Caudate, putamen forming the striatum. And the so-called fibers of the internal capsule passing through them create a striped appearance. Although the putamen and globus pallidus together form a lens-shaped mass called the lentiform nucleus. So the lentiform nucleus is formed by the putamen and the globus pallidus. The striatum is formed from the caudate and the putamen. Okay, they're functioning separate. Each nuclei has their own functions. The basal nuclei receive input from the entire cerebral cortex as well as other subcortical nuclei and each other via relays with thalamus. We're going to get to the thalamus as we are coming through in this lecture. The thalamus is a relay station for most of the tracks. It basically edits as well as brings it all together to help in the connection. It's like a bridge to all the connections of the brain. Disorders of the basal nuclei include Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. Why? The question here is, if you have problems in the basal nuclei, they are somewhat overlapping with the function of the cerebellum. They have a function of fine-tuning the movements and like initiating the movement and restricting the movement. So if there's a problem with the basal nuclei, as you know in Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease, you're going to have some kind of seizures, you're going to have hand tremors. So problems with these are going to initiate the movements, involuntary movements of your hand. So that's why they have disorders of the basal nuclei cause these diseases. In addition to their motor functions, they follow action selection, which initiate and stop intended movements. The basal nuclei plays a role in cognition and emotion as well. Like I said, like a brain, not one thing is not doing only one thing. They have a function in almost everything, but they're connected. In all these cases, the basal nuclei seem to filter out incorrect or inappropriate responses, passing only the best response onto the cortex. They overlap the cerebellum function. It doesn't completely overlap it, but it has somewhat of a function like the cerebellum. That completes our main cerebral hemisphere. The whole cerebral hemisphere is completed by this. And we have the diencephalon, which is formed by the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The diencephalon is enclosed within the third ventricle. Now, talking about the thalamus, first thing is that you have many nuclei named in this textbook, but you don't need to know them, but you don't need to know the names. All right. So the thalamus is the relay station for information coming into the cerebral cortex. Whatever information comes into the cerebral and into the brain is taken into first the thalamus, which basically sorts and edits the information. Within the thalamus are a large number of nuclei, mostly named according to the location, which you don't need to know from an exam point of view. Each nucleus has a functional specialty and each projects fibers to and receives fibers from a specific region of the cerebral cortex. Now, within thalamus, information is sorted and edited. Impulses having to do with similar function are relayed as a group, while the internal capsule, which is a group of fibers which span out, if you remember the picture, as corona radiata. As the efferent impulses reach the thalamus, we have a crude recognition of sensation and as pleasant or unpleasant. So it's all about the information which comes into the brain is taken to the thalamus. The thalamus selects what to send to where, and then it goes to the location, and that's where we sense everything. In summary, the thalamus plays a key role in mediating sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning and memory. It is truly the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Now, coming to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is just going to be just below the hypothalamus. I want to get back to the location of the thalamus actually. We will cover this. It forms the superolateral of the third ventricles. It forms the superolateral of the third ventricles. You need to know the location. But the hypothalamus forms the inferolateral walls of the third ventricle. And like the thalamus, the hypothalamus contains many functionally important nuclei. The mammillary bodies are one of them, which are pea-like nuclei that bulge ventrally from the hypothalamus and are relay stations in the olfactory pathways. Olfactory refers to the sensation of smell. Now, what is the infundibulum? You must have studied this in the endocrine system when you learned of all of your glands and everything. It's the hint of this is it's found at the base of the hypothalamus. So you should be knowing this if you're studying this in CNS. Your exam really close. So the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Despite its small size, the hypothalamus is the main visceral control of the body, and it's vitally important for controlling the body's equilibrium. It's really crucial that the hypothalamus is not damaged because it controls many functions of your whole body. As we say, the visceral control means all of your organs in the visceral part. Now, all the functions to show how truly wonderful the hypothalamus is. It's such a small organ in a way. It's such a small part of the brain. It controls so many things. It controls the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary movements by controlling the activity centers of Spain or centers of the brainstem and spinal cord. In this role, the hypothalamus influences the blood pressure, the force of the heartbeat, digestive tract motility, eye pupil size, and many other visceral activities. It initiates physical responses to emotions. It is connected to the limbic system, the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic system. All is relayed through the hypothalamus. It controls the endocrine system function. As you learned in the endocrine system chapter, it'll release the releasing hormones as well as the inhibiting hormone. It's the first relaying path of everything. It regulates the body temperature. It regulates the food intake. It triggers the feeling of hunger. It regulates water balance and thirst by one of its own nuclei. That we have the supraventricular nucleus, which is secreting antidiuretic hormone, which is used for water balance and thirst. It regulates the sleep-wake cycle. Acting on the brain region, the hypothalamus helps regulate sleep. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is what controls our biological clock, and it sets the timing of the day-sleep cycle, primarily in response to the day and darkness cues received. So if it's like dark, it starts showing that it is dark, and it induces a bit of like melatonin for you to sleep. Now again, we have the clinical case. All the clinical cases in the textbook are very important because these are where the questions are coming from. And the hypothalamic disturbances cause a number of disorders. A question can come that a person has started losing his ability for like his hormones are not releasing, or he's having problems in his let's just go back here to make really understand this. He's having problems in regulating his body temperature. He's having problems in the sympathetic system. It's gonna be because of the hypothalamus. It's the main part of the brain that controls all of the functions. As you can see here, the hypothalamus can be damaged by radiation, trauma, surgery, whatever. Now, the last part of our diencephalon is the epithalamus. The most dorsal portion of the diencephalon, the epithalamus, forms the roof of the third ventricle. Now, the roof of the third ventricle is our epithalamus, the superolateral is our thalamus, and the inferolateral of our third ventricle is our hypothalamus. Extending from its posterior border and visible externally is the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland secretes melatonin, which works along with the hypothalamic nuclei, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle depending on the light and darkness cues that we receive from the retina. And if you want to go into connecting it, the retina is taken from the frontal eye field or in the occipital lobe. there's a ways to connect it. You should always be connecting all the information through which lobe and everything. It really helps you learn and solidify your foundation. Now on to my partner, Mohammed.
Okay, now guys, let's dive into the brainstem. Now, the brainstem from superior to inferior, it starts from three parts. The midbrain, then the pons, then to the medulla oblongata, then to the spinal cord. Okay? Now, each region of the brainstem is 2.5 centimeter long. Like they account only for 2.5% of the total brain mass, which is something small here. Now, the tissue organization. Here, we have the brainstem. As you see, guys, the inner side, we have inner gray matter. And between the inner and the outer side, we have white matter. And within the white matter, there is some gray matter embedded within the white matter. As you see, this is the gray matter, it's embedded within the white matter. Now, it has a nuclei of gray matter embedded in the white matter, as we said. And the key functions of it, which is produce automatic and survival critical behaviors. And of course, there is associated with 10 of the cranial nerves. As we see, each one is connected to the parts of the nerves with the brain, with some nerves and bones also, and the medulla oblongata, as we see later. Okay, now let's go. Let's go on. Now, here the most important thing is to know, like, there are the nerves associated with each part of the brainstem. Now, you guys don't need to memorize the name, of course. You just need only to know the number of the nerve. The one that innervate the midbrain, 3, cranial nerve number 3, cranial nerve number 4. Okay? Now, for the nerves that innervate, cranial nerves that innervate the bones, they are the cranial nerve number 5, number 6, number 7. Okay? Now, the nerves that are associated with the innervation of the medulla oblongata, it is the nerves that the number 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. As I said, you don't need to memorize the names, only the numbers. This is very, very helpful to memorize in your exam. You can memorize like this: 3, 4, stop, 5, 6, 7, stop, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's it. And here, as you see, the superior cerebellar peduncle, in middle cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle, these like the connections between the cerebellum and the brainstem, as we'll see later in the cerebellum part. Okay, let's go on. Now, let's start with the midbrain. Now, the location of the midbrain, it is between the diencephalon and the pons, basically. Now, it's like to have two cerebral peduncles from the vertical pillars. Okay, the peduncle is like little feet, like they hold the midbrain. Okay. The crus cerebri of each peduncle contains the pyramidal, the corticospinal motor tract, which is the most important thing, that from the internal capsule, from the cortex, it will come this and will make the crus cerebri, and it contains the corticospinal tract, which is the tract that's associated with the brain, that connects the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, guys. Now, the superior cerebellar peduncle, as I said, it connects the midbrain to the cerebellum. I highlight because it's really important. And here we have the cerebral aqueduct, which is a hollow canal connecting to the third to the fourth ventricle. Okay, as I said here, periaqueductal gray matter contains the nerves that are associated with the innervation of the midbrain, which is innervation nerves, cranial nerve number 3, cranial nerve number 4. That's it. Let's go. Now, the major nuclei that found in the midbrain. The most important nuclei that found in the midbrain is the corpora quadrigemia. Okay? It's like 4 dome-like protrusions in the midbrain appear in the posterior. Appear in the posterior of the midbrain. It's like 4, each one, there are superior and we have inferior. Each one is paired. Paired superior, paired inferior. Okay? So we have two upper side, 2 lower side. Now, in the dorsal surface, now we have superior colliculi, we have the inferior colliculi. This is very important to memorize because it's important for your exam, guys. Superior colliculi is associated with the visual reflex centers, okay? But the inferior colliculi is the auditory relays and reflexive responses to sound. Like there is an example mentioned in your book, startle reflex. What does it mean? It means like maybe if I'm sitting in the class, okay? And then like maybe my doctor enter the class and like they hit the door. They become angry. Like we see him, exactly what's happening. Like our attention goes to him. This is an example of the inferior colliculi, how to respond to the auditory reflexes. Now, we have other two nuclei. It's important also, substantia nigra and the radionucleus, okay? Now the substantia nigra is a pigmented band-like nucleus, like a band, deep to the cerebral peduncle. There has two functions, or one function basically, another one depends on it. First of all, it releases dopamine, which is make us happy, the hormone that make us happy. And the degeneration of the substantia nigra causes the Parkinson disease. As we will take later in the diseases, I will explain how it, like, this is an introduction. Degeneration of the substantia nigra make a Parkinson disease. So memorize it. Now the nucleus, as we said, it is an oval, not band-like, it's an oval nucleus, deep to the substantia nigra, okay? So it's deep to the substantia nigra. Why is its name it's red? Because it has a rich blood supply, basically. What is the information? It is relates the descending motor pathways for limb flexion, also, it is embedded in the reticular formation. The reticular formation, by the way, you don't need to know it, but it is excluded for you guys. And yes, that's the most important thing in here. And like now, we go to the pons. The pons. Location, it is wedged between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. It's in the middle of the brainstem. A bridge chiefly composed of conduction tracts. The most important thing here is the fiber tracts. There are two mainly fiber tracts found in the pons. The deep projection fibers and the superficial ventral fibers. The deep projection fibers, it's run longitudinally, okay? So it goes from up to down, from where? From the brain to the spinal cord. So it acts as a pathway for the corticospinal tract to goes in the spinal cord, from the brain to the spinal cord. Superficial ventral fibers, it's run transversely, the opposite, transversely, dorsally, to the behind, to the four middle cerebellar peduncle. As I said, there are superior, middle, inferior. This is the middle. Which is the middle that connect the pons to the cerebellum, which is dorsally. So the cerebellum is the most posterior. So it's like connect the cerebellum to the pons here, like this. Okay? There is also nuclei called pontine nuclei. It's like relay information between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. That's it. Now the most important thing also is to know that the nerves, the cranial nerves that are associated with the pons, 5, 6, 7. That's it. Also, which important function is work with the medulla. It helps the medulla to maintain the normal rhythm of breathing. So, as we later see, the respiratory centers that found in the medulla oblongata, it takes some help from the pons to perform the whole function. Of course, with the hypothalamus. Okay, now let's go. Move on. And the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is the most important part of the brain stem. We should memorize everything here, literally. But not everything, I will highlight the most important things. Now the location is the most inferior part of the brainstem, blends into the spinal cord. It's the one that exactly drains to the spinal cord directly. Okay, the two longitudinal ribs formed by the corticospinal tracts, decussation of the pyramids. Guys, decussation of the pyramids here with the key point that Mawhid mentioned it in his part. The point where most fibers cross over to the opposite side, which is each hemisphere controls the voluntary movements of muscles on the opposite side of the body. What does this mean? If like we have something like some people like have a patient come to the hospital, have like a hemiplegia from the right side of the brain, like a stroke on the right side. What does this mean? It will be hemiplegia, as he said, but which part will be less control? There is no control of it. The right or left side? Of course, the left side, because the right it becomes a stroke. Exactly, guys. So now let's proceed. Other external features like we have inferior cerebellar peduncle. Inferior cerebellar peduncle, it connects the medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. Olives, like they are not important too much. It's like oval swellings caused by the underlying inferior olivary nuclei. You don't need to know it. It sends relay sensory into the cerebellum. And the cranial nerves are important also, which is, we said 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, now 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's it. Move on now. Okay. Sensory relay nuclei. There are also some nuclei, but also not as much important. The nuclei in the midbrain is much important than this. But it's a nucleus gracialis, nucleus cuneatus, It relays sensory information for touch and proprioception from spinal cord to the somatosensory cortex. And cochlear and vestibular nuclei, from its name, vestibular, so equilibrium, and the cochlear nuclei, it's important for relate the auditory information. Okay, but it's not that important, as I said. Now, the most important thing in the medulla oblongata is the following. The reflex centers. It's very crucial for homeostasis, and it's mostly work with the hypothalamus with it. We have 3 centers. It's not like it's two centers and other like minor centers. The most important, cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. What does it mean, the cardiovascular center? If anything, any change happen in the cardiovascular rhythm, like maybe the heart rate, the blood flow, let's see the venous return, as you will take in by 2, no problem now, in these terms. It will continue from this medulla oblongata, and also it work with the hypothalamus to make the homeostasis, to return it back to its function. The cardiac center, the vasomotor center, which is the blood pressure within the blood vessels. Okay? The respiratory centers, as we said, generate the respiratory rhythm with pontine centers. As I said, the pons work with the medulla oblongata to generate the respiratory rhythm, to work with to facilitate this process with the respiratory. Now other centers, it also regulate the vomiting, the coughing, the swallowing, and sneezing, okay? And as I said, the hypothalamus controls its autonomic commands, which is the visceral commands, by relaying its instructions through these medullary centers. Okay, so everything happens, it should pass during the medulla oblongata. Moving on. Now, we have some questions here. Which of the following structures is not found in the medulla oblongata? Okay, guys, of course it will be crus cerebri. Why? Because, as we said, the castration of pyramids, where is it found? Pyramids are found in the medulla oblongata. Pyramids, medulla oblongata. Where is the medulla oblongata? Crus cerebri. It is in the midbrain. Other question we have here. Which of the following neural reflexes is mediated by the superior colliculus of the midbrain? Okay, let's see the answer. The answer is visual reflex. Of course, you said there are two colliculus, the corpora quadrigemina in the midbrain. Superior and inferior. And superior connect the visual, control the visual reflex, and the inferior control the auditory reflex. Moving on, we also have another question. Which part of the brain contains the nuclei of the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7? Let's see the answer. Pons. As I said, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's it. Which brain region is crucial for regulating visceral activities such as heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure? The answer, of course, is the medulla oblongata. As I said, it's work with the hypothalamus to retain the homeostasis back with these important visceral centers. Let's see. I think it's the last question. What are the enlargements on the medulla oblongata that are involved in the conscious skeletal muscle control? Let's see the answer. Pyramids. As I said, the constitution of pyramids. The pyramids with the right side of the brain connect the opposite side of the body, and the other side also the opposite. Let's go. Now let's start with the cerebellum. Okay, guys. Now, first of all, the cerebellum is mainly, when you hear cerebellum, you think about equilibrium and coordination of movement. Mainly, when you hear cerebellum, equilibrium, coordination of movement, ensuring coordination and balance. Okay. What is the location? It is dorsal to the brain stem, dorsal to the pons and medulla oblongata specifically, inferior to the occipital lobes. Occipital lobes are here, cerebellum will be there. It is inferior to the occipital lobes, and it is posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata. Functions, process inputs to coordinate skeletal muscle contraction for smooth, coordinated movements and agility. Okay, let's proceed. Structure is like two hemispheres similar to the cerebrum. Two hemispheres connected by the vermis, and then the vermis is which to connect the two cerebellar hemispheres. Surface, convoluted surface with folia. Folia, like it's similar to the gyri, like we find it in the cortex, in the cerebral cortex. It's similar to it, which is called folia, which is a little bit smaller than the gyri, but yeah. Here we have a lobes. Oh, that's important. This is so important. The anterior and the posterior lobes and the flocculonodular lobe. Flocculonodular lobe. When you hear it, think of the balance, equilibrium, eye movements. Okay. Anterior posterior lobes that coordinate other body movements. And then when we talk about the eyes, when we talk about the balance, we want to talk about the equilibrium. We were talking about the flocculonodular lobe. The internal composition, we have a gray matter, outer cortex. It's similar to the cerebral. The gray matter, we have the outer cortex. White matter, we have the deep white fibers, which is called arbor vitae. Like it's meaning tree of life. I don't know why they said like this name, but maybe it's something similar. Don't know. Okay, now the deep cerebellar nuclei embedded in the white matter. Deep cerebellar nuclei embedded in the matter, which is called dentate nuclei. It's an example, no need to know it. Let's proceed. Now, there's a parasagittal section, posterior view of the cerebellum. As we see here, let's show. This is the anterior lobe, as we said, the one that is in the up, the one in the posterior, the one in the posterior below, is the posterior lobe. And like something that it's caused between the anterior and the posterior lobe, which is the flocculonodular lobe. So there are three lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, flocculonodular lobe. We have the cerebellum, of course, and this is the arbor vitae, which is the white matter, and this is the cerebellar cortex. And yeah, this is, of course, as I said, we take cerebellar peduncle, superior, middle, inferior, which is the connection of the brainstem to the cerebellum. And here we see the fissures and the cerebellum also. And this is the anterior lobe. We can see it. This is a posterior view. Okay, this is parasagittal. Parasagittal we take it from the side. Posterior view we take it like this section. We see it from posterior view. So we can see the upper one, the lower one. We can see the lateral, but we can't visualize both anterior and posterior. This is orientation. Okay, vermis, which is the one that connects to the two cerebellar hemisphere. And yeah, this is the main thing that you need to know. And the primary fissure, I think that it's separate the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Let's move on. This is also important, guys. The functional organization of the cerebellar cortex. We have the medial portion, we have the intermediate portions, we have the lateralmost portion, and the flocculonodular lobes. Let's finish from this because we already take it. Flocculonodular lobes, when you hear it, equilibrium, balance, eye movements, direct. Adjust posture to maintain equilibrium, and also some for the eye movements. Now we have medial and intermediate, lateral. Okay? Let's start from the intermediate part of the cerebellum. What does it control? It influences the distal parts of limbs. Hands, feet, all of these are coordinated by the intermediate parts of the cerebellum. The medial portion, which is influence which part? Activities of the trunk, and the girdle muscles. The girdle, like, is one in the shoulder, in the shoulder, yeah, the girdle muscles, and also on the trunk. Okay. The lateralmost portions is information from the cerebral association areas, which is working. Lateralmost portion, which is working with the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So connection between them is mainly controlled by the lateralmost portion of the cerebellum, which is planning movements rather than direct execution. As we said, the direct execution from the cerebral cortex, for sure. This is like planning movements. It's helping to plan movements with the cerebral cortex, of course. Now let's proceed. Cerebellar peduncles, as I explained before. Now we will not take that, but this is the most important thing to know, guys. Here, all fibers entering and leaving the cerebellum are ipsilateral. What does this mean? We said in the cerebral cortex, they are contralateral, which is the right side affected, left side of the body it's affected. Here, if the right hemisphere of the cerebellum, right cerebellar hemisphere is affected, the right side will be the most affected part, not the left side. Memorize like this: cerebrum, contralateral, cerebellum, ipsilateral. Now, as I said, superior cerebellar peduncles to connect the cerebellum to the middle brain, middle cerebellar peduncles, pons to the cerebellum, inferior cerebellar peduncles, medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. Okay. And here how the cerebellum works. First of all, it receives of body position and momentum from the proprioceptors, eyes, and the equilibrium pathways. So it receives the signals, then it interprets, calculates the best way to coordinate force, direction, and extent of muscle contraction. So it analyzes what to take, what to do an action. The action in the third part sends a blueprint for coordination back to the cerebral motor cortex, and the cerebral motor cortex will analyze this and will produce the movement. As I said, it's a planning, not execution of movements, not execution. Result: prevents overshoot, maintains posture, and ensures smooth movement. Okay. Now let's go. The cerebellar dysfunction. When there is a dysfunction of the cerebellum, what may be? Because it happens. Let's see. Effects of damage: loss of muscle tone, which is called hypotonia, clumsy, uncertain movements, ataxia, as this guy. He cannot control his movements. Like maybe he falls sometimes. Yeah, he can walk, but he cannot control like this, and sometimes he falls like this. Difficulty with balance and coordination, vertigo. It's called vertigo, but not to need to know. Only ataxia. Cognitive role, also there is a cognitive role for it. Emerging evidence for roles in thinking, language, and emotion, but it's not that important compared to the upper one. Okay, now we have a questions, guys. Which of the following functions would be most affected by damage to the intermediate parts of the cerebellum? We said there is intermediate part, there is a medial part, there is a lateral part, there is a folliculonodular loop. Now he said, okay, let's take that first. Okay, let's see the answer. The answer is coordination of voluntary limb movements. The intermediate is contained the limbs, the hand, the feet, as I said. Let's move on. Through which cerebellar peduncles does the pons transmit information to the cerebellum? The middle cerebellar peduncle, of course. As I said, pons to the cerebellum, midbrain to the cerebellum, superior, medulla oblongata to the cerebellum inferior. Now we have a case question. A 45-year-old man presents with unsteady gait, difficulty performing rapid alternating movements, and tremors that become more pronounced when he tries to reach for an object. Neurological examination suggests a lesion in his cerebellum. What is the most likely effect of this damage? Let's see the answer. Of course, lack of coordinated movement. He said lesion in the cerebellum. So of course, coordinated movement, direct. Doesn't movement, of course, no. Decision making, of course, no. Mission and instability. It's not the most important thing to deal with the cerebellum. Okay, now we will go to the higher mental functions. Higher mental functions. Let's go. Now, the higher mental functions, in the brain are the language, memory. Now we start in the language. Let's start from this side now. Okay, the language. Language implementation system involves two important areas in the cerebral cortex. The Broca's area, the Vernix area, and also the basal nuclei. But here we will focus on the Broca's area and the Vernix area. Broca's area, usually it's appear on the dominant side of the dominant side hemisphere, which is, I am right-handed, right? My Broca's area is found in the left side of the hemisphere because it's contralateral. So my Broca's area is found in the left hemisphere. Direct muscle move for the left-handed, of course, they will be in the right side, of course. But it's less, it's like 5 to 10%. Direct muscle movements for speech production involved in planning motor activities, damage. Understands language, but cannot speak fluently. What does this mean? If a patient comes to the hospital and he can interact with the doctor, like the doctor talks to him, but he cannot answer, he cannot produce this speech, but he can understand the doctor, and if the doctor asks him a question, he able to answer, but like if a paper, he can answer like handwritten, but cannot produce the speech. Here we know that the Broca's area, guys, is affected. The opposite with the Vernix area. We have a patient, also come to the clinic. The doctor can talk to him. He is not understanding. he is like talking word salad. You know what is word salad? Like it's not understandable language, but he can produce speech. He can speak, but it's not understandable. Here we know that the vernix area is affected. Okay, this is mostly coming in your exam. It's most important, really important. Non-language dominant hemisphere, which is the hemisphere is the non-dominant one. It's usually the right hemisphere, as I said. Usually the right hemisphere, yeah. It's involved in the non-verbal language, emotional tone, and gestures. Like the facial expressions when we become angry, it happens. It's mainly control of the non-dominant hemisphere, and the opposite of the left-handed, of course. Now let's proceed. Now start with the memory. The second high mental function. It's a storage and retrieval information. It's like we memorize names, faces, words, dates, anyone we interact with each day, friends. Stage of declarative memory storage. Now we have two types of memories, guys. The short-term memory and the long-term memory. And the long-term memory, which is the ones that we try to improve it. Okay, the short-term memory, limited capacity, temporary holding pen, which is the limited capacity, and temporary. The long-term memory is the vast capacity, large capacity, and relatively permanent. It's permanent, it cannot go. You think of it, permanent. Now, how we transfer from the short-term memory to the long-term memory is enhanced by four types. One, emotional state, like we have excitement, alertness, or maybe for a trauma. It's something like we introduce to it, like trauma, and we never forget it. Yeah, the exams maybe. Rehearsal, repetition. Repetition, like we repeat the information again and again and again and again. So of course it will be transmitted to the long term. Association, which is tying new information to the old one. And automatic memory, it's like unconscious. It is automatic. It is random. We can, like this, I know something I cannot control, but it's transmitted directly to the long-term memory. It happens. Now we have a homeostatic imbalance. Now I highlight for you the important things. Damage to the hippocampus and the surrounding medial temporal nerve obstructions. It will occur and it will cause only slight memory loss. But the bilateral destruction, widespread, is caused widespread amnesia. And guys, there are two types of amnesia as we saw later. Anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia, what does it mean? If the patient has anterograde amnesia, he will be able to remember the past relative memories, but he will not be able to produce a new memories. So, if you ask him, like if you ask one that have anterograde amnesia, my name is Mohammed, come to him after 5 minutes, he will not even remember you. Even less than 5 minutes. The retrograde amnesia, the opposite. He able to make a new memories, but he can't remember the relative memories. This is called the retrograde amnesia. Okay. Let's go. We have a question here. A 42-year-old man was involved in a car accident and later developed an inability to speak, although he was still able to understand the spoken language. The lesion is most likely located in which of the following brain areas? Of course, Broca's area. As I said, inability to speak. He cannot speak, but he can understand. Broca's. He can speak, but he cannot understand. Word salad. Vernix. Direct. Now, another question. You assess the condition of a patient suffering from head trauma after a car accident. You notice that the patient cannot remember your name, despite repeating it many times, but he still remembers his relative names. What is the medical term to describe this condition? Let's see the answer. Of course, anterograde amnesia. He cannot remember your name, but he can still remember his relative names. The opposite, retro. Now let's go to the brain protection, which is important. Now, let's take it from this side. There are 4 mechanisms of the brain protection. The skull, the bone itself, the meninges, which are the membranes found within the brain, cerebrospinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier. The meninges are the 3 connective tissue membranes, which is lie just external to the CNS organs, okay? Which is the spinal cord and the brain. So it's found in the spinal cord and also in the brain. There are three types, three parts: dura matter, arachnoid matter, and pia matter. Cerebrospinal fluid found in and around the brain and the spinal cord. That is give a buoyancy for the and some protection for the brain and spinal cord. Forms a liquid cushion that gives buoyancy to the CNS structures. Blood-brain barrier, which is the one that determines what the molecules that enter and get out from the brain, because there are something. Well, I'll explain. Some things that some ions or maybe large molecules that is not permitted to even enter the brain because it's highly toxic to the brain, as we'll explain later. Now let's start with the meninges. Okay, now we have dura mater, the first one, which is the outermost one, and the strongest. It consists of two layers, periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. It's very important for your exam, guys. Periosteal layer is the one that found in the brain, but it is not found in the spinal cord. Memorize it like your name. What is its function? Attached to the inner surface of the skull, which is the periosteum. The meningeal layer, which is the true external covering of the brain, which continues caudally inferiorly, and the vertebral canal as the spinal dura mater. Okay. These two layers fuse together around the brain, except in certain areas, of course, where they form the venous sinuses, which is called the dural venous sinuses, as I will explain later in the CSF circulation. Now there are three dural septas that is formed from the dura mater, very important to know. One is called the falx cerebri, one is called the falx cerebelli, one is called the tentorium cerebelli. What does each of these make or function of it? The falx cerebri, it's correspond to the longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres. The falx cerebelli, in its name, runs along the vermis, which connect to the two cerebellar hemispheres. The tentorium cerebelli, which corresponds to the transverse fissure that divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum, between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. Memorize it. You should memorize this. Let's go. And we have a sections here. We have a mid-sagittal section. We have a posterior dissection of a brain. Mid-sagittal section. We have there a highlight, the falx cerebri. The tentorium cerebri. Here we can visualize it better. Let's see. The falx cerebri. There is a cerebral hemispheres. There is cerebellar hemispheres. Okay. This it corresponds to what? To the longitudinal fissure. Okay. This one, tentorium cerebelli, corresponds to what? The transverse fissure. And the falx cerebelli correspond to what? To the vermis. That's it. Now let's go to the arachnoid matter. It is a loose brain covering. That's the second part, the second matter. The loose brain covering that does not dip into the sulci. The opposite as we see in the pia matter, which dip into the sulci. As we'll explain, but memorize it does not dip into the sulci. It's a little bit upward. Above it, okay, we have the two spaces above the subarachnoid space and below the subarachnoid space. We have two spaces. Above the arachnoid matter, it will something space. It's called subdural space below the dura and the below the dura matter and upper the arachnoid matter. And the subarachnoid space is below the subarachnoid space and it's upper to the pia mater. Okay. And the subarachnoid space is mostly the most important one. Why? Because it's filled with the cerebrospinal fluid and also it's have a lot of nerves, a lot of blood vessels serving the brain. Contains the largest blood vessels serving the brain. Now we have some things like called arachnoid granulations here. What does this mean? This are not knob-like projections like this, small projections. Why these are here? Because during the CSF circulation, the CSF will enter from these arachnoid granulations and then it will proceed and continue to drain into the venous blood, into which is called the sinus. It's called a vein, if I'm not mistaken, inner jungular vein of the brain, the jungular vein of the brain. It will drain into it from this arachnoid granulation. So if you don't have an arachnoid granulation, the CSF will be stuck. What does it will drain? What does it will drain? It will not drain. It will accumulate in the brain. So arachnoid granulation is so important. Okay, the pia mater, that is the innermost pharyngeal layer. It's the one that found the inner. It's direct connection between it to the brain. It's exact dip into the sulci and the gyri, mentioned. Following its contours and deeping into all grooves and fissures. Most important thing. It is the only part of the meninges that, following the brain contours and dipping into all the gyri and sulci, which part? Pia mater. That's it. And this is a delicate connective tissue, but it's also richly vascularized. Now here we have a homeostatic imbalance, also this is important. Now we have two types, meningitis and encephalitis. From its name, inflammation of the meninges and inflammation of the brain. Meningitis, encephalitis. It could be by bacterial infection or viral infection. How we would know it if there is an infection? We obtain a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid via a lumbar tap, and we take it like from the patient, we drain it, and we examine it in the laboratory, and then we will check if it is there is a meningitis or no. And here is a section of the brain, of the skull, sorry. Here we have the bone of the skull. Here we have the meninges, urometal, arachnoid metal, pia metal, periosteal layer, meningeal layer. Periosteal layer is not found in the brainstem, memorize it. It's only found in the brain. Not brainstem, sorry. It isn't found in the spinal cord. It's found only in the brain. And the meningeal layer, this is arachnoid metal, pia metal, and the arachnoid granulation, as you said, it helps in the CSF circulation. Okay. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid. We have three things that we don't know: functions, the circulation, the formation. That's it. The functions. What is the function of the cerebrospinal fluid? We already mentioned it like 100 times. It's but this is a new reduce brain weight by 97%, which is large percentage. It will give balance to the brain, protection from trauma, nourish the brain, carries chemical signals also. And this is the most important thing, which is it has a literally, it has some shared compositions with the plasma with slight differences. CSF has this protein, has this calcium, has this potassium, compared to what? To the plasma, blood plasma. But it has more sodium, more chloride compared to the blood plasma. That will talk us about the blood-brain barrier. That why does it contain more sodium, less potassium? I will talk about it. But like know which one has higher, which one has lower. Now the formation. How does the CSF this formed? It's produced by some capillaries found in the ventricles, especially in the lateral ventricle. It's produced in the lateral ventricle and then it proceeds to its journey. Produced by choroid plexus in the ventricles. The ependymal cells, as I said, of the choroid plexus have tight junctions between them and ion pumps that allow them to modify the filtrate and are ciliated to help keep the CSF in constant motion. So the ependymal cells have a seat also that's ciliated to push the CSF in one direction. It's like a compulsive power stroke you take in the cells chapter, the cilia. So it's ciliated. Circulation of CSF, now this is important. Now it starts the formation of it in the lateral ventricle. Then it will flow to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen. Then it will flow to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct, which is to connect the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, a hollow canal. Then it will enter the subarachnoid space via something called lateral and medial apertures. Circulates around the brain and the spinal cord. As I said, it goes to the brain and it's goes to the spinal cord, the brain to the spinal cord. And how it's retained, how it is trained? It retained to the blood via arachnoid granulations, and it will go here and it will drain to the internal jugular vein, okay? Which is the dural venous sinuses. That's it. Now we have a homeostatic imbalance. Also, it is important. As I said, when the CSF is produced faster than it is drained, it will accumulate in the ventricles. The increased pressure on the delicate brain tissue causes brain damage. Now, it is occur in adults, but it mostly happens in babies, in the infants. In adults, the skull is rigid and the head cannot enlarge its end. So mostly it's fatal. The patient will die most of the times. In infants, with stools have not yet formed, so it's like it can be managed. That have not fused, the increase in this pressure, the accumulation of the CSF, it's called hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is found in the infants only. It's not in the adults. In the adults it will die. It's not called hydrocephalus, I think. Yeah. Now it's obstruction. How the obstruction of normal CSF occurs? It occurs by like three things. Maybe it occurs by a tumor. It occurs maybe by meninges, and the meninges, or meningitis, or the trauma in the brain trauma. Insert, how we can treat it? Okay, how we could treat this hydrocephalus? Like we insert a flexible tube or a shunt into the patient, into the ventricles exactly, which is relieve and take this cerebrospinal fluid and empty it drain it into the abdominal cavities or the cavity or the cardiovascular system. Here we can relieve this disease in the infants. Okay, and there's a picture of baby with hydrocephalus. Let's go. This is the blood-brain barrier, which is the fourth protective layer. Blood-brain barrier is the protective mechanism that helps maintain the brain stable environment. And here we see the similarities and the differences between the most capillaries in our bodies and the capillaries found in the brain. It's a continuous capillaries. What does it mean continuous? Let's see the differences. Okay, here the most capillaries we see like it has endothelial cells, it has the pericytes for support, it has also a basement membrane. It has here we have intercellular cleft. Okay, here we have intercellular cleft. Here, in the other side, in the brain, we don't have this cleft. Despite of it, we have a tight junctions. We don't have intercellular clefts in the brain capillaries. And also we have astrocyte, of course, the glial cells, one of the glial cells types, which is for the nourishment of the vein and the protection, and that's it. Astrocytes with the pericytes here, it's written. It induces formation of the tight junctions. It induces the formation of the tight junctions. It helps. The tight junction between endothelial cells are the key structures of the blood-brain barrier, as we said. Here no tight junctions between the endothelial cells. And exclude molecules except those that are lipid soluble from the brain tissue, as we'll talk now after this, I guess. Astrocytes and the pericytes. Okay. Yeah, this is important. What gets through? Now, guys, there are two main ways the substances enter the brain. There are simple diffusion and also the specific transport mechanisms. All of this you take in the cells chapter. That's nothing new, but mainly some specifiers for the brain, because it's our brain. We need to protect it, right? Okay, the simple diffusion allows fats, any lipid soluble it will go. Fats, fatty acids, oxygen, carbon dioxide, other lipid soluble molecules pass through. Simple diffusion. Direct pass within the plasma membrane. Now we have specific transport mechanisms as facilitated diffusion and transcytosis. This for what? For larger molecules or for non-lipid soluble, which is water soluble molecules. The water soluble molecules like glucose, amino acids, and curtain ions move by facilitated diffusion, by channels, carriers, and that's it. Transcytosis, which is the vesicular transport, it's called like the larger substances. It's something that cannot be handled with facilitated diffusion, of course. Something large to move or in out of the brain by transcytosis. Okay? Here is the most important thing. Why did I told you before, guys, it is low potassium compared to the blood plasma? Because small non-essential amino acids and potassium, ions are blocked and actively pumped out of the brain. Why? Because it's highly toxic. It's highly toxic if we find a potassium in the brain. So if we even find it, the brain will dispose it outside directly. Metabolic waste, proteins, toxins, and most drugs cannot cross into the brain. Okay, guys, let's continue. Breakdowns of blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is not constant throughout the brain. Why? Here are some examples. There are some spaces that doesn't have a blood-brain barrier or does have small amounts of the blood-brain barrier. Some brain areas surrounding the third and the fourth ventricles, the barrier is entirely absent. and that's why the capillaries also are permeable. This is why, like vomiting centers at the brainstem. Vomiting centers at the brainstem needs to monitor blood for poisonous substance, so it doesn't have any blood-brain barrier. The hypothalamus regulates water balance, temperature, and other metabolic, other visceral functions, activities. Also important thing that the barrier, the blood-brain barrier, is not complete in the neonates and the premature infants. So we should take this into consideration because there are potentially toxic substances can enter the CNS and cause problems. So yeah, we need to be focused in this part as doctors, of course. Injury to the brain may result in a localized breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Okay, makes sense. Injury to the brain may result in a localized breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Okay. Now we have questions. A case. A patient presents with a rapid decline into a coma following a head injury. Imaging reveals a collection of blood characteristic of a subdural hematoma. The condition arises from the accumulation of blood between which two anatomical layers? Of course, dural metal and dural. Here's the keyword: subdural hematoma. What does mean subdural? It's the space between the dural matter and the upper to the arachnoid metal. Subdural hematoma, and then the injury occurs between the dural metal and the arachnoid metal. Let's proceed. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates around the brain between the of course, the arachnoid matter and the pia matter, as I said here, note the ACL is located in the subarachnoid space. Another question: which of the following parts of the dura mater separates the cerebellum from the overlying cerebral hemispheres? The answer is tentorium cerebelli. As I said, it corresponds to what? To the transverse fissure. Falx cerebelli, it corresponds to the vermis. Falx cerebri corresponds to the longitudinal fissure. Which of the following meningeal layers is absent in the spinal cord? Let's see. Of course, periosteal dura mater. It is only found in the brain. It is absent in the spinal cord. Memorize it. It's important. I think the last question. Which of the following structures is a cluster of specialized capillaries responsible for secreting cerebrospinal fluid into the brain ventricles? The answer is, of course, choroid plexus, which is one found in the left ventricles and it produces CSF and the circulation. Now, the last part of my slide: the brain injuries and the disorders. Let's go. And this part is, they like to get questions from it. You should memorize it and know the entire important things for each disorder. Okay. Now we'll start with the traumatic brain injuries. And there are 4 types of traumatic brain injuries: the concussion, the mildest one, the contusion, intracranial hemorrhage, cerebral edema. Okay? The concussion, the mildest, which is temporary alteration in the brain function. Temporary, not permanently, okay? Dizziness, loss of consciousness. It's the opposite one of the contusion, as we said later. Like it's temporary, focus on this. And like dizziness, loss of consciousness. The contusion is a permanent neurological damage, which is one that we need, it is important. Sorry guys. Okay, let's proceed. Intracranial hemorrhage, when there is a bleeding in the skull, of course. Bleeding, which is an increase to the blood pressure. This will increase blood pressure. Subdural or subarachnoid space, that occurs in the body. Compression brain tissue. And the cerebral edema, when the swelling happens in the brain. As a result, maybe of increase in the fluid content of the brain, and also this will increase the pressure. So what would we give as a medication for these injuries? You think? There is a medication called osmitrol. Why we give it to the patients? Because it decreases intracranial pressure. Because it's increased the pressure, so we should decrease it, right? So osmitrol. Now the cerebrovascular accidents, other name is stroke. Stroke. Definition: when there is no blood supply come to the brain. It's called ischemia. It's caused by 2 things. Maybe of the ischemic stroke, which is the most common in the cases, which is an obstruction of the artery, or like blood clot. like a thrombus, like an thrombus, and another one called embolus. Yeah, it will happen in the ischemic stroke or hemorrhagic stroke. What does this mean? When the blood vessel it's ruptured, maybe. I would say the blood vessel break. This is called hemorrhagic stroke. But the most common is the ischemic. Effects, loss of function depends on area affected, hemiplegia and speech defects. As I said, hemiplegia on the right side of the brain, it will affect the left side. Hemiplegia on the left side, it will affect the right side. And that's it. A stroke in the left, right body we cannot control. Stroke in the right, we cannot control to the left side. Transient ischemic attack, mini stroke, this is the mini stroke. It's not like this one. It's like a temporary reversible episode, warning sign of major stroke. It's like the beginning of the stroke. It's like give something like hint that be careful. Treatment, we give to the patient clot-dissolving drugs such as tissue plasminogen activator. And this you will take it in the bio tool. We will take some explanation of it. You need to know that it's clot-dissolving drug. Because we are a blood clot, we want to dissolve this clot to release the obstruction. And we allow the blood goes to the brain. Now we have the last three diseases, Alzheimer and Parkinson, Huntington, the brothers. Okay? Now let's start with Alzheimer. Alzheimer disease is the definition of progressive degenerative disease of the brain that ultimately results in dementia. After the Alzheimer, it causes dementia. It's known. It comes to anyone. But it's a disease, of course. It can come, and also it can come. Depends. It affects 5 to 15% of people over 65. A major cause of death for those over 85. Because brain shrinkage, after we become old, our brain it will shrink in function. The key symptoms, like we have a memory loss, we have a shortened attention span, we have a disorientation, language loss, even changes in the personality, in the irritability, moodiness, or even the confusion. You'll see like this. Yeah. It's not like with us. Yeah. It's not interacting with us normally. Continuous hallmarks of AD of Alzheimer's disease brain tissue. Now there are two things that accumulates in the Alzheimer's disease, which is the senile plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles. Senile plaques, it's like accumulation of something called beta amyloid peptides between the neurons. It is toxic to the brain cells. And the neurofibrillary tangles, it's something called the tau protein. It's found inside the neuron. It will accumulate and disrupt the cell transport and even killing the neuron. So these two are the main causes of the Alzheimer's disease. And the progression of it, these misfolded proteins, as I said, tau protein and beta amyloid peptide, killing cells and causing brain shrinkage, as I said. And also the affected areas are the hippocampus and the cortex, which is critical for memory and thinking. This is the most important vulnerable areas, which is the affected areas. Now let's go to the Parkinson's disease. Results from a degeneration of dopamine releasing neurons is a substantia nigra. As I mentioned in the midbrain, decrease or degeneration of the substantia nigra, it causes a Parkinson's disease. Key symptoms: tremor at rest, okay, which is hand movements, running hand movements. You can feel some problems when we have hand movements like this. This is called tremor. Forward bent posture and shuffling gait, and stiff bent like this posture, like this. Mostly the one with Parkinson move like this, okay. And stiff facial expression. He can't do a facial expression good. And also slow movement, initiation and execution, which is called bradykinesia. This is a picture of the bradykinesia. Blank facial expression, slow, rigidity. This is for the Parkinson's disease. How we can treat this? We administering L-DOPA, which is a drug precursor converted to dopamine in the brain. Also adjunct drugs to inhibit dopamine breakdown, and also deep brain stimulation for advanced cases, electrodes that shut down abnormal activity. It's similar to it's similar to think that we have a heart block. Heart block also we need to use this medicine, this treatment. Also future therapies, there are gene therapy, stem cell implants, still experimental, it's not confirmed. Now the Huntington disease, the last disease we have here. It is a fatal hereditary disorder, so it's hereditary, so it can be transmitted within the fathers and siblings and mothers degenerations, I mean, that strikes in middle age caused by a mutant Huntington protein that accumulates. So there is a protein called Huntington that accumulates within the brain tissue, which leads to massive degeneration of the basal nuclei and later the cerebrocortex as well. So first it affects the basal nuclei. Key symptoms, something called chorea. It's like initial symptom of wild, jerky, involuntary, flapping movements. It's like jerky, it's like not normal, you know. Marked mental deterioration later in the disease. Progressive and usually fatal within 15 years. And also, so it's fatal, it's going to be killed the patient. Its hyperkinetic symptoms are the opposite of Parkinson, as we said, hypokinetic symptoms. Hypokinetic, so hypokinetic. We cannot tremor, like as you said in the Parkinson. Like here we have a chorea, and this the opposite, exactly the opposite of bradykinesia. This is chorea, which is jerky movements, abnormal movements. We don't do it in nature. Treated with drugs that block dopamine effects, the opposite. Parkinson's, which is treated by enhancing dopamine, here we block the dopamine by drugs, some drugs. Here we have questions. So the following is the mildest consequence of traumatic brain injury. Of course, it's concussion when you see the mildest. Exactly. Mildest, concussion. Now, another question. Dopamine is an important neurotransmitter. Which disease or disorder results when the neurons in the brain that produce dopamine die? Of course, the answer is Parkinson's disease. The neurons in the brain that produce dopamine die. When it die, it's out of Parkinson's. Also, a case question. A patient suffering from memory loss, shortened attention span, disorientation, and eventual language loss is most likely suffering from which of the following disorders? Let's see. Alzheimer's, of course. This is the symptoms. Memory loss, shortened attention span, disorientation, and eventual language loss. The degeneration of dopamine-producing neurons. In which of the following structures is the primary cause of the Parkinson's disease? Of course, it is substantia nigra, which is found in the midbrain. I think it is the last question. Which of the following diseases has an increased amount of tau protein? Of course, it is Alzheimer. As I said, beta amyloid peptide and tau proteins. They will be accumulated in the brain tissue. And I think this is my part. Yes, thank you so much, guys. And my friend Mawhid will come.
So now we're going to do the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. We are talking about the higher centers of the brain. Now we're going to talk about the relay centers of the spinal cord, the nervous system. The spinal cord is about 42 centimeters long and 1.8 centimeters thick, and it's the two-way conduction system to and from the brain. It takes all of the sensation and motor nerves to the brain, and the connections from the brain come down to the body through the spinal cord. The spinal cord is protected by the bone, meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid. The single-layered spinal dura mater is not attached to the bony walls. As Mohammed had mentioned before, the periosteal layer is not found in the spinal cord. And between the bony vertebrae and the spinal dura mater is an epidural space which is filled with fat and has a network of veins which helps in cushioning. The cerebrospinal fluid fills the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and the pia mater meninges. Inferiorly, the dural and the arachnoid membrane extend to the level of S2, the sacral 2 level, but the spinal cord ends at the L1 and L2 level. For this reason, the subarachnoid space within the meningeal sac inferior to the point provides an ideal spot for our lumbar puncture, so it does not damage the spinal cord. This is the clinical application which is widely used to test the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, I want to discuss this image. So before we get into all of this, I need you to know that there are 31 spinal nerves, okay? And you need to know the distribution of the bones. I saw given in your syllabus, but it's good to know. We have C7, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, we have T12, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the sacrum is made from about 3 to 4 bones, and coccyx is 1 bone. Alright? Now, we come to the filum terminale. It is the fibrous extension of the conus The conus medullaris is the end of the spinal cord. It's the tapering end of the spinal cord. And after the conus terminalis, we'll have an extension of the spinal nerves which go down, and this is called the cauda equina. All right. Now, I want to talk about the attachments of the pia mater. Furthermore, sawtooth shells of pia mater called denticulate ligaments secure the spinal cord to the dura mater matrix throughout its length. All right. And you should be able to see the final terminale is at the end of this is the coccyx level. The conus medullaris ends at the L1 to L2 level, and from there onwards you have to have the cauda equina, which takes down and supplies all the lower limbs. There are obvious enlargements where the nerves serving the upper and lower limbs arise. These enlargements are called the cervical and lumbar enlargements. The cervical enlargement is around the level of C5 to T1, and they provide the nerves for the upper limbs. And the lumbar is from T5 to L2, and you don't need to know these numbers, it's just not in your syllabus. They're from T5 to L2, providing the nerves for the lower bodies. As we spoke before, the 31 pairs of spinal nerves that pass through the intervertebral foramen. The cauda equina is a bunch of nerve roots that extend after the conus terminalis. Now, why is the vertebral column much longer than the spinal cord? Why doesn't the spinal cord go all the length? It's because during embryological development, the spinal cord grows faster than the spinal cord. The vertebral column grows faster than the spinal cord. To catch up, the spinal cord has the cauda equina, which are the extensions which go down all the way. Okay, now the spinal cord cross-sectional anatomy, when we cut the spinal cord like this, we'll have an anatomical view from the top. The spinal cord is somewhat flattened from the front to back with two grooves. On the anterior portion, we have an anterior median fissure, and at the back side, we have a dorsal median sulcus. Again, as we go back, a fissure is more of a deeper groove, a sulcus is more of a narrower groove. These grooves run the length of the cord and partially divided into right and left halves. The grey matter of the cord is located in its core, the white matter outside, and the cerebrospinal fluid filled central canal that runs the entire length of the spinal cord. Alright, now I want us to look at this picture. You can see the anterior fissure, and this is the median sulcus. Alright, the dorsal projection of the grey matter are the dorsal posterior horns. These are the dorsal posterior horns. These are the anterior horns. These are the lateral horns on the side. The lateral horns actually start from the thoracic stage of the intervertebral column, and they go up to the lumbar. All right. I just want to get down with the layering of how it actually works. We have the spinal dura mater, which doesn't have the periosteal layer. Then we have the arachnoid matter. Then the pia mater, which has a plexus of veins. All right. Now, lateral horns. The two lateral horns are connected by a central grey matter bridge called grey commissure, which is this. This is a grey commissure connecting the two lateral ventricles, and in between that we have the central canal, which has the cerebrospinal fluid running throughout. Now, the dorsal horns consist entirely of interneurons. This is not exactly completely true, but it has mostly the neurons. Now, I want to give you a pro tip. When we talk about the ventral aspect or the anterior aspect of the spinal cord cross section, we are talking about the motor or the somatic nerves coming into and out of the spinal cord. When we talk about the dorsal portion, we're talking mostly about the sensory. All right. So the ventral horns are subinterneurons, but mainly house bodies are somatic motor neurons. These motor neurons send their axons out to the skeletal muscles via the ventral rootlets that fuse together to become the ventral roots of the spinal cord. As you can see in this, this is the anterior portion, this is the dorsal portion. Over here we have the somatic. From here we have the sensory. Always. This is a very common generalization. It's the best way to learn it. Okay? The ventral horns are the largest in the limb innervating cervical and lumbar regions. More work equals larger size. So over here you will see, as we see the cross section, the amount of gray matter increases in the thoracic and the lumbar regions to provide for this to innervate all of the body parts. Now I just want to get to this one term over here, ganglion. Ganglion is the collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is just outside the spinal cord and the brain. Alright? The cell bodies associated with sensory neurons are found in the enlarged region of the dorsal root called the dorsal root ganglion. I want to go back to this previous picture to show you what the dorsal root ganglion looks like. This is the dorsal root ganglion, in which there's the sensory neurons come up from the posterior side, and there are more cell bodies here. That's why it's outside the spinal cord. That's why it's called ganglion. The cell bodies here which provide the axons to innervate the rest of the body from there on. Okay. After entering the cord of these neurons may take a number of routes. They can either synapse at a higher level or at the brain level, or they can synapse into the dorsal horns, the spinal cord gray matter at the entry level. They can move into the same level or a high level or a lower level. The dorsal and the ventral roots are very short and fuse laterally to form the spinal nerves. Alright, they come together. I'm going to go back to this. And over here you see them both combined. They form the spinal trunk, which then goes on and branches off again to form our nerves. How many nerves do we have? We have 31 nerves. It's an important number for you to remember. Now, we come to the white matter of the spinal cord. The white matter of the spinal cord is composed of myelinated and non-myelinated nerve fibers that allow communication between different parts of the spinal cord and the brain. These fibers run in three directions. They are either ascending, going towards the higher centers of the brain, descending, going down from the cord, from the brain to the lower levels to innervate the different body parts, and transverse, like the commissural fibers, across one side of the cord to other. Okay? The white matter on each side of the cord is divided into three white columns, or funiculi, named according to their position as a dorsal, lateral, and ventral funiculi. This is actually not that important as for your exam point of view, so we are going to move ahead with it. Okay, now, spinal cord trauma and disorders. The damage to the dorsal root or sensory tracts result in either the loss of sensation or paresthesis, it's called paresthesis, that's the actual term for it. The damage to the ventral roots are going to cause paralysis. Why? Because the ventral is all about motor and the dorsal is all about sensory. So throughout the lecture, as we've spoken, you need to know the damage association, where something is damaged, what is being affected, because they will ask you the question that Mohammed has provided us with such good questions. This is the kind of question you'll get. He has had a damage in his ventral part, affecting his shoulder, arm. If he has a transection cut over there, he's not going to have any control over that, no voluntary control. If he has it in the dorsal part, which innervates the arm, he's going to lose sensation in his arm. Okay, now we're going to come to the types of paralysis. The flaccid paralysis of the skeletal muscle occurs when the spinal cord or ventral roots are injured. The nerve impulses do not reach the affected muscles, which consequently cannot move them voluntarily or involuntarily as well. Normally a spinal cord actually has a reflex. So even if you have some kind of paralysis, if it is spastic paralysis, you would have a reflex action as well. But you cannot control it voluntarily. Now as for flaccid paralysis, without stimulation, the muscles atrophies and becomes smaller. Spastic paralysis occurs only if the upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex or axons in the spinal cord are damaged, which means that when we have the primary motor cortex, which is if you remember, it's in the precentral gyrus, the tracts coming from there, the corticospinal tracts, if they are damaged, then the muscle the muscle is not going to atrophy, but the movements are not going to be voluntary, because we have the voluntary movement from here. They're going to have their involuntary spasms and so on. Now, we come to the transection bit of it, and this is where I can guarantee you guys a question for sure. A transection of the spinal cord at any level results in total motor and sensory loss in body regions inferior to the site of the damage. If the transection occurs between T1 and L1, both lower limbs are affected, resulting in paraplegia. Alright? If the injury occurs in the cervical regions, it's gonna cause quadriplegia because in the cervical we have it innervating our upper limbs as well. As we have to recall here, the cervical enlargement, right, is from C5 to T1. Now, post T1, if it cuts, it's gonna have your upper limbs are safe. Everything below is gonna become problematic. Anything above the C5 or between the C5 level is gonna affect the whole body in itself. Now, hemiplegia is paralysis of one side of the body, usually reflects brain injury rather than spinal cord injury. And as Mohammed had mentioned, hemiplegia, we had the contralateral side about it, like he explained, the right side brain problem in hemiplegia, and the right side of the brain damage on this side is going to affect the left side of the body. Now, there's also a term called spinal shock, which is a transient period of functional loss that follows the injury. Spinal shock immediately depresses all reflex activity caudal to the lesion side. Caudal means lower. Bowel, bladder reflexes stop, blood pressure falls, etc. Below the injury, all the muscles are paralyzed and insensitive. Now, the pathology of the spinal cord. We're going to deal with two types of pathology. The polymyelitis. Over here, polio means grey matter. Myelitis means inflammation of the spinal cord. It results from the poliovirus, which typically enters the body in the feces contaminated water and destroys the ventral horn motor neurons. If it damages the ventral motor neurons, it's going to affect the movement. The patient develops flaccid paralysis, in which we will have muscle atrophy. Alright? Fortunately, vaccines have nearly eliminated this disease, and a global effort is ongoing to eradicate it completely. As we all know, we all must have taken the polio vaccine. So this is what polio would do to you if you did not have the vaccine. Now, we have the ALS, or the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is also called the Lou Gehrig's disease. Is a devastating neuromuscular condition that progressively destroys the ventral horn motor neurons and the fibers of the pyramidal tracts. So not only is it going to affect your voluntary control, it's also going to cause paralysis in some cases. All right. As the disease progresses, the patient loses the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe. Why? Because the control of all of these are in the medulla oblongata as well, and it really pushes the pyramidal tracts to become damaged, and this will in turn cause death, which typically occurs within 5 years. In 10% of the cases, mutations are inherited. It's either due to mutation or spontaneous mutations are probably involved in the rest. Recently, the mutations have been localized to genes that are involved in RNA processing. And I just want you all to remember, in the spinal cord, the most important questions which will come for the exam is going to be from the transection. Please remember, if it's cervical, you're going to have quadriplegia. If it's below the T1 level, it's going to affect only the legs, paraplegia. And thank you very much. I would like to call upon Mohammed to come with me, and we would like to thank you all for attending this session. And yes, I hope best of luck for the exam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. I hope you find this session benefit for you, and hope the best for your exams. Thank you.